The open secret about the Vietnam War was that America didn't just wage it in Vietnam. All of Southeast Asia was fair game, as the US unleashed all of its military might to crush the communists. The massive bombing of Laos, which turned it into the most bombed country in history, is usually forgotten. But even more unknown is the suffering the US inflicted on Cambodia. Between 1963 and 1973, the US dropped over 2.5 million tons of bombs on Cambodia and invaded it for several months. The memory of this has been buried, along with the tens of thousands of corpses that Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, and the rest of the US leadership left behind. In this video, we will expose the secret war the US waged in Cambodia, a war that was an atrocity in its own right, but also paved the way for the monstrous genocide of the Khmer Rouge afterwards. If that sounds interesting to you, then consider leaving a like to support this video, and subscribe for more content on important historical events like this. The Vietnamese-Cambodian border is rough terrain of hills and jungle. Infrastructure and maps are unreliable, and many villages are unreachable by road, even today. In the late 1960s, many of these villages were virtually cut off from the outside world, and the only way to reach them was to trek through difficult terrain on foot or drop in from the air. While they were technically in Cambodia, the Cambodian government meant little to the daily lives of people there. This weak control made it easy for the North Vietnamese to slip across the border and establish bases in Cambodia, to strike at US and South Vietnamese forces. In 1963, Cambodia's King Sihanouk made a secret deal with Communist China to turn a blind eye to these bases on his soil. Bases in Cambodia and neighboring Laos became an important part of North Vietnam's Ho Chi Minh Trail, which allowed the North to move men and supplies to continue fighting. Inevitably, US intelligence figured out that their enemy was using Cambodia as part of the war effort. The US later claimed that Sihanouk and the Cambodian government gave tacit permission for the US to conduct anti-communist activity. This strategy of secretly cooperating with both communist and capitalist countries while officially remaining neutral was a core part of Sihanouk's Cold War policy. Other sources dispute this and say Sihanouk only gave the US permission to pursue fleeing Vietnamese troops across the border during combat engagements, not conduct a multi-year bombing campaign in his country. Between 1965 and 1969, 2,565 bombing sorties would be launched against Cambodia. US bombers operated largely out of Thailand. In 1961, they signed a secret agreement with the Thai government to get permission to launch from their air bases. As much as 75% of US bombing of Southeast Asia was launched from Thailand. The US employed a range of aerial strategies. Conventional mass bombing from B-52s was the standard, but helicopter missions were also common. The village of Don Rat was on the front line of these attacks. The village was hit multiple times in 1969 by helicopters seeking out Vietnamese guerrillas. US policy in Vietnam designated areas as free fire zones. Shoot first, ask who you shot later. This applied to anything from infantry right up to attack helicopters. Survivors of Don Rat remembered villagers scattering when they heard the helicopters coming in. People would panic, they would run. Sometimes they made it, sometimes they would be killed, one survivor recalled. Survivors believed that half of the village was killed or wounded by US attacks. There were hundreds of other villages in the same boat. As early as 1968, US bombers stationed in Allied Thai air bases were also dropping Agent Orange over targets in Cambodia and Laos. One estimate says the US sprayed over 150,000 liters of it over Cambodia during the war. The long-term health effects of Agent Orange are well known: breathing difficulties, birth defects, and cancer, to name a few. The US has never offered compensation to the Cambodian victims of these attacks. Agent Blue, an arsenic-based herbicide designed to destroy crops, was also widely used. Agent Blue was dropped over rice paddies believed to be used by the Vietnamese, but the US could never be sure who really owned them. They decided that the risk of starving civilians was an acceptable price to hit the communists. Systematic use of herbicides was also seen in Laos and Vietnam, but its use in Cambodia is harder to track. Hundreds of Cambodian villagers reported that US planes had dropped chemicals on their crops. However, it has been difficult for researchers to pin down when and where the US did these attacks, or how much damage they did. Some attacks are known though. In April 1969, for example, US bombers dropped Agent Blue over thousands of hectares of rubber trees that were vital to Cambodia's economy. The damage caused a 12% drop in Cambodia's exports and provoked a serious diplomatic incident. The US officially denied that it was responsible and blamed the Vietnamese. US attitudes changed on February 22, 1969, when North Vietnam launched a new offensive against South Vietnam from its bases in Cambodia. President Nixon was irate and called up his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to discuss how to respond. Both men agreed that Cambodia had to be bombed more, regardless of what the Cambodian government had to say about it. From the start, Nixon knew he did not legally have the power to expand the war there on such a scale. He also knew the public backlash would be intense. Secrecy was the rule, and the administration made every effort to hide what they were doing from anyone else. As Nixon ordered Kissinger, "No comment, no warnings, no complaints, no protests, I mean it. Not one thing to be said to anyone publicly or privately without my prior approval." Even the pilots weren't allowed to know what their targets were until they were in the air. Operation Menu began on March 18, 1969, with Operation Breakfast, named for the early morning Pentagon meeting where it was planned. 60 B-52 Stratofortress bombers were dispatched to targets along the Vietnamese-Cambodian border. But during the mission, most were redirected to targets within Cambodia itself. Operation Breakfast was a roaring success. Nixon and Kissinger happily approved 5 further missions, targeting areas where US intelligence believed NVA or Viet Cong troops were hiding. Operations Lunch, Snack, Dinner, Supper, and Dessert followed, targeting areas that were known to have civilians in them. But Nixon and Kissinger insisted that these casualties would be minimal. Later, the Joint Chiefs of Staff confessed that they really had no meaningful way to estimate civilian casualties on any of their bombing runs. Over the next 14 months, Operation Menu launched 3,000 sorties and dropped 108,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia. Every day, the orders were delivered in secret to the air bases, and pilots were under strict instructions not to talk about their work. False coordinates were given on reports to mislead any would-be leakers, and most mission-related material was burned at the end of each day. Despite Nixon and Kissinger's efforts, though, knowledge of the bombing slipped out. On May 9, 1969, the New York Times exposed the fact that America had been running secret bombing campaigns in Cambodia. But the scale and targets were still unclear. Nixon was irate. He ordered the FBI to investigate a number of journalists and aides over the leaks, which led Nixon to approve illegal phone tapping to monitor them, a habit that would take him down during Watergate. As far as Nixon was concerned, everything he was doing was for national security, and anyone who opposed him was a threat to be monitored or dealt with. For all the trouble it took to keep Operation Menu a secret, the bombings weren't actually successful. They failed to identify the communist headquarters they'd been seeking, and made little impact on North Vietnam's military operations across the border. If anything, the bombings only made events worse. The communists fled deeper into Cambodia to avoid the bombs, which led to increasing conflict with the Cambodian authorities and increasing contact with Cambodia's own Khmer Rouge communists. Shockingly, bombing a neutral country did more to start new conflicts than solve existing ones. Things got much more complicated in Cambodia in March 1970. Sihanouk's pivot towards China and the USSR was an unacceptable shift in Cambodia's politics for Washington. While Sihanouk was visiting France in March 1970, his Prime Minister Lon Nol seized power and declared the formation of a new Khmer Republic that was firmly anti-communist and pro-US. Like so many other pro-US coups, the CIA has long been suspected of having a hand in events, but concrete evidence had never been found. Lon Nol's coup was not welcomed by the Cambodian people. Prince Sihanouk was still quite popular, and Lon Nol seemed to represent a new age of American colonialism after they had waited so long to be rid of French control. Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge guerrillas declared their opposition to Lon Nol and received a flood of support, including from Prince Sihanouk. North Vietnamese forces in East Cambodia also allied themselves with the Khmer Rouge and declared their hostility to Lon Nol as well. Naturally, the US began funneling weapons to Lon Nol and made plans for more direct intervention against Lon Nol's communist opponents. America and South Vietnam drew up plans for an invasion of Cambodia's eastern border regions between April and June 1970. The goal was to eliminate the 40,000 estimated North Vietnamese troops in the region, who had seized upon Lon Nol's coup to capture large areas of eastern Cambodia. Nixon kept the invasion plan a secret until a few days before it was launched. He made a public address on April 30th, 1970, informing the American people, but the wheels had been in motion behind the scenes for weeks. The South Vietnamese had already launched their invasion the previous day. Even Congress was blindsided. The invasion, or as Nixon insisted on calling it, the incursion, was concentrated on the Fishhook, an area of Cambodia that jutted into Vietnam. 30,000 US troops and 40,000 South Vietnamese poured across the border, supported with armor, artillery, and air power. The only person more shocked than the Americans was Lon Nol himself, who first learned that his country was being invaded by watching Nixon's speech on TV. The invasion placed countless Cambodian lives in the firing line. South Vietnamese and American troops rolled into villages, searching houses of terrified Cambodians without consent. Several villages were damaged or completely destroyed to deny them to the communists. The Vietnam War was full of horrendous cases of what happened when unsupervised troops were let near civilians. See our video on Tiger Force or South Vietnamese war crimes for 2 examples. And Cambodia was no different. Just one example occurred on May 16, 1971, when US and South Vietnamese troops fired on a village with machine guns and artillery, which killed 8 Cambodians, 2 of them children, before looting the ruins. A US investigation confirmed that US troops had done this, but the only punishment was 2 letters of reprimand sent to the unit's commanding officers. As expected, the invasion was hugely unpopular in America. The war in general was already unpopular, so the unauthorized expansion of it into another country at the cost of more civilian lives was only going to make people angrier. Students took the lead in the protests, which turned into a tragedy at Kent State University on May 4th, when Ohio National Guardsmen gunned down 4 student protesters. The Kent State protests were a direct result of US policy in Cambodia and permanently shifted US public opinion against Nixon and the war in Southeast Asia. The invasion failed to locate the elusive communist headquarters in the region, and the communists realized it was easier to just flee deeper into the jungles than stand and fight. However, it did disrupt supply lines through Cambodia and crippled communist efforts to use it in the war against the South. On June 30, 1970, the Senate passed the Foreign Military Sales Act to cut off funding for US military operations in Cambodia. It failed in the House of Representatives after US troops were withdrawn from Cambodia on schedule. While ground troops left in June, US air operations continued to support the South Vietnamese and Cambodians against the communists under Operation Freedom Deal. Initially, the US limited its bombing to the east, but over the following months, they expanded to hit almost anywhere in the country. The US effectively waged an undeclared air war on the Vietnamese communists and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia for the next 3 years. The bombing angered the Cambodian people, turning them against the US and the Cambodian government, who were complicit in it. This made them more willing to support Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. As one officer of the Rouge later said, it was because of their dissatisfaction with the bombing that they kept on cooperating with the Khmer Rouge, joining up with the Khmer Rouge, sending their children off to go with them. Sometimes the bombs fell and hit little children, and their fathers would be all for the Khmer Rouge. As one US embassy official in Phnom Penh wrote, "In short, US policy has been unwittingly to increase the chance for a communist victory." By 1973, controversy over the continued bombings forced Congress to rein Nixon in. It is often forgotten that the first articles of impeachment filed against Nixon were over this undeclared war in Cambodia. This first impeachment failed to pass in Congress, but they did pass a law forcing an end to the bombing by August 15, 1973. Nixon and Kissinger ramped up the campaign before the deadline, and as much as half of the bombs dropped during Operation Freedom Deal were dropped in the last few weeks. August 15, 1973 brought US bombing of Cambodia to a close. The devastation would last long after that. Thousands dead, a nation broken by US air power in a war Washington wouldn't even admit it was waging, and thousands more driven into the arms of the Khmer Rouge as a result. After 2 more years of fighting, the Khmer Rouge captured Phnom Penh in April 1975. The regime would rule Cambodia for 4 nightmarish years, leaving somewhere between a quarter and a third of its population dead. Ironically, it was communist Vietnam who would invade and topple the Khmer Rouge in 1979, after the 2 communist nations turned on each other without a common US enemy to unite them. It took years for the US to fully admit what it had done. In late 2000, Bill Clinton became the first US president since Nixon to visit Vietnam. As a gesture of good faith, Clinton ordered documents relating to the bombing of Southeast Asia to be declassified. Among these documents were the records of the Cambodian bombings. They revealed an estimated 2.75 million tons of bombs were dropped in 230,000 separate bombing missions, with at least 8,000 of these missions being large-scale carpet bombing. Critics of the US like Noam Chomsky and William Shawcross have cited the bombing as one of the worst crimes against humanity committed by the United States. It left between 50,000 and 150,000 people dead, but some estimates run as high as 600,000 or even 1 million. Clear information on the population in the worst affected areas are not reliable either before or after the American bombs fell. Both supporters and critics of the bombing have every incentive to pick the number that suits them best. Another 65,000 people have been wounded, or killed by unexploded bombs since the war ended. The men responsible never faced consequences. Presidents Johnson and Nixon retired to peaceful lives after the presidency. Henry Kissinger lived to be 100, dying only in 2023. He spent the rest of his life completely unapologetic for what he had done and downplaying its effects. It was not a bombing of Cambodia, but it was a bombing of North Vietnamese in Cambodia, he later said. Tens of thousands of graves dug in the Cambodian jungle would beg to differ. If you want to learn more about similar crimes committed by the US and other countries elsewhere, check out the other videos on our channel. We also have a video on what came next for Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge. As always, consider leaving a like on this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to keep up with more content like this.